Have you ever had one of those days where everything goes wrong for Ophelia? Calloway, a 24-year-old waitress in New York City that day, was about to get infinitely worse. She was just trying to survive her shift, pay her bills, and hold on to the last piece of her family's legacy. But when Rafferty Holloway, a billionaire with ice in his veins and a fortune built on ruthlessness, sat down at her table, her world was set on a collision course with his. What happens when a single accidental drop of spilled wine unleashes a storm of fury that threatens to destroy her? And what shocking secret is waiting in the wings, ready to turn the tables in the most unimaginable way? Stick around, because this isn't just a story about a bad customer. It's a story of hidden histories, brutal power, and the day a titan of industry picked on the wrong person. The air in The Gilded Spoon was thick with the scent of money. It wasn't just the truffle oil drizzled over handmade pasta or the aged French leather of the banquettes. It was the invisible yet palpable aroma of wealth that clung to its patrons. For the staff, it was the smell of pressure. For Ophelia Calloway, it was the smell of survival. At 24, Ophelia moved with a practiced grace that belied the frantic calculations spinning in her mind. Each table was a tiny kingdom she had to conquer with unerring politeness and efficiency. Table 7 needs more water. Table 4 is ready for the check. The couple at 9 are arguing again. Avoid eye contact. The mental checklist was her shield against the chaos. This job wasn't her dream. Her dream was a dusty canvas and the smell of turpentine, a quiet studio where she could paint the tumultuous cityscapes that lived in her head. But dreams didn't pay the mortgage on her late grandmother's house in Queens, a small creaking monument to a happier time that was now facing the grim threat of foreclosure. The bank, a faceless entity named Sterling National, didn't care about the memories etched into the floorboards or the rose bushes her grandmother had planted. They cared about the 3 årsverintise, due at the end of the month. So Ophelia traded her paintbrushes for a tray and a tight-lipped smile. "Ophelia, you've got the Holloway reservation at 8, said Mr. Henderson, the restaurant manager. He was a good man, perpetually frayed at the edges from trying to mediate the worlds of the super-rich and the barely scraping by. "He's particular. Just keep your head down. Be quick, be perfect." "Particular is my specialty," Ophelia replied with a confidence she didn't feel. Her co-worker, Jessica, a sharp-eyed cynic who had seen it all, sidled up to her as she polished wine glasses. "Holloway, good luck. Last time he was here, he complained the ice was melting in a non-uniform pattern." "I'm not kidding." He sent back a glass of water. Ophelia sighed. "Another one of those." "Not just another one." Jessica warned, her voice low. "He's Rafferty Holloway, of Stratton Corp. The guy buys and sells companies like they're baseball cards. He doesn't just complain. He annihilates." Ophelia knew the name. Stratton Corp was a predatory investment firm famous for hostile takeovers. They were corporate sharks who smelled blood from miles away. The name alone sent a shiver of a different kind of cold down her spine, the cold of untouchable power. Meanwhile, 30 blocks south, in a glass tower that scraped the clouds, Rafferty Holloway was ending his day. His office was an exercise in minimalist dominance. A single massive desk of polished obsidian faced a floor-to-ceiling window with a god's-eye view of Manhattan. There were no family photos, no personal trinkets. There were only clean lines, sharp angles, and the silent hum of his own success. "The numbers for the Aerotech acquisition are soft," Rafferty said into his speakerphone, his voice a low, commanding baritone. He didn't look at the cityscape. He looked through it, as if analyzing its structural weaknesses. "Their board is sentimental. Legacy, employee loyalty, unquantifiable liabilities. I want a new angle. Find their debt. Find their personal vices. Find a lever. I want them broken by Friday." "Yes, Mr. Holloway," a tinny voice replied, full of fear and obedience. He disconnected the call without a goodbye and stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. At 38, Rafferty Holloway had the kind of severe, chiseled good looks that seemed engineered for magazine covers about financial titans, but his eyes, a startlingly pale grey, held no warmth. They were the eyes of a predator, constantly scanning for the next target, the next weakness to exploit. He was meeting a woman named Brittany for dinner. He couldn't remember her last name. She was the daughter of some board member, a decorative piece meant to signal social normalcy. Relationships, like everything else in his life, were transactions. He provided access and luxury. She provided a pleasant, undemanding presence. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Ophelia's grandmother's house. 7:45 p.m. Time to go. His driver was already waiting downstairs. As he rode the silent elevator down, he felt a familiar, gnawing emptiness. He had conquered this city, bent its financial institutions to his will, and yet satisfaction remained elusive. The only thing that ever filled the void, however briefly, was the assertion of his power, the thrill of seeing others bend to his command. It was a hunger that was never sated. Tonight at the Gilded Spoon, he was just a man going to dinner. But he brought the entire weight of his world with him. Ophelia felt the shift in the atmosphere the moment Rafferty Holloway walked in. It was as if the air itself had snapped to attention. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and moved with an aura of absolute certainty. The woman on his arm, Brittany, was a cascade of blonde hair, sparkling jewels, and a vacant, practiced smile. Mr. Henderson personally escorted them to the best table in the house, a secluded corner booth overlooking the restaurant's private garden. "Holloway's here," Jessica muttered as she passed Ophelia. "Showtime." Ophelia took a deep breath, plastered on her professional smile, and approached the table. "Good evening. My name is Ophelia, and I will be your server tonight. May I start you off with some water? We have still sparkling or our house-filtered artisanal—" "Still," Rafferty cut her off before she could finish his gaze, fixed on the wine list. He hadn't even looked at her. He didn't need to. In his world, people like her were functions, not individuals. They were the disembodied hands that brought him things. "And for you, miss?" Ophelia asked, turning to Brittany. "Oh, I'll have a sparkling, please. With a raspberry?" she asked, looking to Rafferty for approval. He gave a slight, dismissive nod. Ophelia returned promptly with the waters. She placed Rafferty's down. His eyes flickered to the glass for a fraction of a second. "Is the temperature satisfactory, sir?" she asked, remembering Jessica's story. He picked up the glass, swirled it, and took a small sip. "It's adequate." The word was a dismissal, a confirmation that she had barely met the lowest possible standard. The meal proceeded with a quiet, simmering tension. Rafferty ordered for both of them without consulting Brittany, selecting the most expensive items on the menu, the lobster bisque, the A5 Wagyu steak, and a bottle of 1998 Chateau Margaux, a wine that cost Ophelia a full week's pay. When she presented the wine, her hands were steady, a small victory. She performed the ritual with practiced care, presenting the label, cutting the foil, cleanly easing the cork out with a soft sigh. She poured a small amount for Rafferty to taste. He lifted the glass, not to his lips, but just to his nose, inhaling deeply. He closed his eyes for a moment. Ophelia held her breath. "Acceptable," he finally declared, setting the glass down. It was the highest praise he seemed capable of giving. Ophelia began to pour for Brittany, then for Rafferty. The rest of the restaurant faded away. Her world narrowed to the stream of dark red liquid, the crystal glass, and the powerful man sitting before her. This was the moment. the most expensive item on the table the point of no return. She finished pouring for Rafferty and was carefully pulling the bottle back when it happened. A busboy, a new kid named Leo, who was still clumsy with nerves, was rushing past with a heavy tray of dishes. He stumbled his elbow, catching Ophelia's arm with just enough force to jolt her. It was a tiny, fractional movement, but it was enough. A single perfect stream of crimson wine arched through the air, landing directly on the pristine white shirt and the light grey silk tie of Rafferty Holloway. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a black hole that sucked all the sound and air from the room. Brittany gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Leo the busboy froze his face, a mask of pure terror. Other diners, sensing the sudden shift, turned to stare. Ophelia's heart didn't just drop, it evaporated. She saw the dark stain spreading across the impossibly expensive fabric. It wasn't just wine, it was a declaration of war. Rafferty Holloway looked down at his shirt. He didn't move for a full 5 seconds. He simply observed the stain as if it were a strange new life form. Then, very slowly, he lifted his gaze. His pale grey eyes, now the colour of a winter storm, met Ophelia's. And in that moment, Ophelia knew her life had just irrevocably, catastrophically changed. The gilded spoon was no longer a cage. It was an execution chamber, and she was the one on the block. The venom in Rafferty Holloway's voice was shockingly quiet, which made it all the more terrifying. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He spoke in a low, controlled tone that sliced through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere like a razor. "Do you have any idea," he began, his eyes locked on Ophelia, "what this shirt costs?" Ophelia's mouth was dry. Her professional training, her entire mental shield, had crumbled to dust. "Sir, I am so sorry. It was an accident. I can get you a club soda assault. We can have it professionally cleaned, of course. The restaurant will cover everything." "Cleaned." He let out a short, mirthless laugh that was more unnerving than a scream. "This is a custom-tailored Charvet. You don't clean a stain like this. You discard it. And the tie is Stefano Ricci. Together, they are worth more than you will make in 6 months." Every word was a calculated blow designed to diminish and humiliate. He wasn't just angry about the shirt. He was offended by her very existence in his vicinity. The spill wasn't an accident. It was an unforgivable intrusion of her clumsy, insignificant world into his pristine one. Brittany, his date, looked horrified, shifting uncomfortably. "Rafferty, it's okay, really." "It is not okay," he snapped, turning his cold fury on her for a split second before refocusing on Ophelia. "This isn't about the money. It's about incompetence. It's about a complete and utter lack of professionalism. This establishment purports to be one of the finest in the city, and yet they employ clumsy, unqualified people who are incapable of performing the most basic tasks." By now, Mr. Henderson was rushing over his face, pale. "Mr. Holloway, I am terribly sorry. Please allow us to handle this. The entire meal is, of course, on the house, and we will compensate you for the cost of your attire, whatever it may be." Rafferty waved a dismissive hand, not even gracing the manager with a glance. His entire focus was a laser beam pointed at Ophelia, who stood frozen, the wine bottle still clutched in her hand like a murder weapon. "I don't want your money," Rafferty said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more menacing. "I want a standard to be upheld. I want consequences. I want her fired." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Fired. Ophelia's blood ran cold. The word echoed in her mind, mingling with the looming dread of the bank and the foreclosure notice. Fired. It meant no income. It meant losing her grandmother's house. It meant failure on a scale she couldn't comprehend. "Sir." Mr. Henderson stammered, his usual placating demeanor failing him. "She's one of our best employees. It was a complete accident. The busboy bumped into her." "I don't care about your internal logistics," Rafferty said, finally turning his chilling gaze to the manager. "I don't care about your excuses. Your staff failed. The failure originated with her. I am a patron of this establishment, one of your most frequent and high-spending patrons. And I am telling you that her presence here is unacceptable. Fire her. Now, or I will not only never return, I will make it my personal mission to see to it that no one I know ever sets foot in this place again." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Ophelia could see the gears turning in Mr. Henderson's head. He was calculating the cost of one waitress versus the cost of losing the business of a man like Rafferty Holloway and his entire social and professional circle. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't a fight at all. "Well," Rafferty demanded, an arrogant arch to his eyebrow, "I'm waiting." Mr. Henderson looked at Ophelia, his eyes full of apology and resignation. He opened his mouth, the fatal words already forming on his lips. Ophelia felt a wave of dizziness. This was it. This was how it all ended. Because a rich man's shirt was more valuable than her entire life. She saw Jessica watching from near the service station, her face a mixture of pity and "I told you so." She saw the terrified busboy Leo being hustled away by another staff member. She saw the other diners, some pretending not to watch, others staring with morbid curiosity at the public execution. Her world had shrunk to this single awful moment of humiliation. "Mr. Holloway," Mr. Henderson began, his voice weak. "Perhaps we can discuss this in my office." "There is nothing to discuss," Rafferty stated flatly. "Your decision should be simple. It's a matter of business. Her or me." Mr. Henderson wilted. He turned to Ophelia, his expression pained. "Ophelia, could you please come with me to the back? It was over. That was the phrase, the prelude to the guillotine." She was being led away to be disposed of, quietly away from the delicate sensibilities of the diners. A single tear of pure hot rage and helplessness traced a path down her cheek. She wasn't just losing a job. She was being erased. She gave a tiny defeated nod and was about to turn when a new voice, calm and steady, cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary, Robert." The voice came from the entrance to the main dining room. It wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that made everyone, including Rafferty Holloway, turn to look. Standing there was a man in his early 30s. He was dressed in simple, well-tailored dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and a stylish navy blazer. He wasn't as overtly imposing as Rafferty, but he possessed a quiet confidence that was just as commanding. His face was familiar to Ophelia, achingly so. It was a face she hadn't seen in person in nearly 3 years, a face that belonged to a ghost from her past. Mr. Henderson's face flooded with relief. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting you tonight." The man, Nate Carter, walked calmly toward the table. His eyes scanned the scene, the stained shirt, the terrified manager, and finally Ophelia, whose face was a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, confusion, and a deep, buried ache. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second when he looked at her, a flicker of something no one else could have caught. Rafferty Holloway looked this newcomer up and down with disdain. "And who are you, the night manager?" Nate stopped at the head of the table. He didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. He looked directly at Rafferty, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. "Something like that," Nate replied smoothly. He then turned his attention fully to Mr. Henderson. "Robert, what seems to be the problem here?" "Mr. Holloway has had an unfortunate accident with some wine. Mr. Carter, Henderson explained, his voice regaining some of its strength. Ophelia was serving him and— "I don't care about the accident," Rafferty interrupted, clearly annoyed by this new variable. "I care about the result. And the result is that this incompetent waitress is to be fired. I was just explaining the economic realities of that decision to your manager." Nate Carter listened patiently until Rafferty was finished. He then turned his cool, assessing eyes back to the billionaire. The faint smile was gone, replaced by a level, steady gaze. "Mr. Holloway," Nate said, his voice even, "I appreciate you sharing your perspective. However, here at the Gilded Spoon, we don't fire our staff based on accidents, especially not our best ones." He said the last part while looking directly at Ophelia, a clear and public vote of confidence that sent a jolt through her. Rafferty scoffed. "Your best one just ruined a $2,000 shirt. Your sentiment is quaint, but it's bad for business. I am your business." Nate leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the back of an empty chair. The entire restaurant was now silent, watching the two men face off. "Let me be perfectly clear," Nate said, his calm demeanor hardening into something more formidable. "You are a customer, a valued one, until about 5 minutes ago. But you don't dictate my business practices. You don't get to bully my manager. And you certainly do not get to humiliate my staff." He paused, letting the words sink in. "So no, I will not be firing her." Rafferty Holloway looked utterly stunned. He was a man who was never told no. The idea that this person, this restaurant manager, or whoever he was, would defy him was incomprehensible. "Do you know who I am?" Rafferty finally asked, the classic retort of the powerful and indignant. Nate Carter's lips curled into a genuine cold smile. "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Rafferty. I know all about Stratton Corp's recent moves. I've been following your attempt to acquire Aerotech Dynamics very closely." Rafferty's expression flickered. The mention of a specific high-stakes business deal shifted the ground beneath him. This was no longer about a stained shirt. This was something else. "What do you know about Aerotech?" Rafferty asked, his voice now laced with suspicion. "I know it's a brilliant little company with a revolutionary new patent for drone navigation systems," Nate said, his tone conversational. "I also know that their biggest obstacle right now is a hostile takeover bid from a firm that wants to gut them for their IP and fire half their staff." He looked pointedly at Rafferty. "Sound familiar?" Before Rafferty could respond, Nate delivered the final devastating blow. He gestured around the opulent dining room. "You see, Mr. Holloway, you seem to be under a slight misapprehension," Nate said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "You think you're talking to a manager." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping from Rafferty to the stunned staff, and finally landing back on Ophelia, who was staring at him as if he were an apparition. "My name is Nathaniel Carter," he announced to the silent room. "And I don't just work here. I own this restaurant." He paused, then added the final twist of the knife, a statement that recontextualized the entire evening. "And Ophelia," he said, his voice softening with an emotion he could no longer hide. "Ophelia is my sister." The revelation detonated in the silent dining room, sending shockwaves that rearranged the reality of every person present. Mr. Henderson's jaw hung agape. Jessica, the cynical co-worker, looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Brittany, the ornamental date, simply looked lost, as if the script for her evening had been abruptly set on fire. Rafferty Holloway's arrogant smirk froze, then crumbled. His brain, so adept at calculating market values and hostile takeovers, struggled to process this new, impossible data. The waitress, the insignificant, clumsy functionary he had just tried to obliterate, was the sister of the owner. And the owner was not just some glorified metrodicit. but a man who spoke of corporate acquisitions with unnerving familiarity. But for Ophelia, the shock was a physical blow. Nathaniel Carter. Nate, her brother. The stranger who shared her blood but had been absent from her life for 3 long, agonizing years. The last time she'd seen him was at their grandmother's funeral, a brief, tense encounter across a sad buffet of cold cuts and regret. He had been dressed in a sharp suit, then, too, looking like a man from a different world. He had offered condolences that sounded rehearsed, and then disappeared back into his life of ambition and success, leaving her to deal with the messy emotional wreckage of their family's end. And now here he was, standing in the middle of her public humiliation, claiming her as his sister as if no time had passed at all. The wave of relief she should have felt was instantly swamped by a tidal wave of resentment, confusion, and betrayal. Where had he been when the first foreclosure notice arrived? Where was he on the lonely nights she spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would ever save their grandmother's house? Your sister. Rafferty stammered the words foreign in his mouth. He looked from Nate's hard, resolute face to Ophelia's pale, shocked one, and for the first time that evening he felt a prickle of something he hadn't experienced in years' uncertainty. He had miscalculated. Badly. Nate ignored him, his attention now solely on Ophelia. The hard shell of the business owner cracked, revealing the older brother beneath. "Liv," he said, his voice soft, using the childhood nickname that felt like a relic from another lifetime. "Are you okay?" Ophelia couldn't find her voice. She just stared at him, 1,000 questions and accusations swirling in her eyes. Nate took a step towards her, but she flinched, an involuntary, almost imperceptible movement that he caught immediately. It stopped him cold. The look on his face was one of deep, undisguised hurt. He had expected shock, maybe even anger, but the raw rejection in that small movement wounded him more than any of Rafferty's insults. He turned back to Rafferty, his expression, once again, a mask of cool control, but this time it was edged with a dangerous personal fury. "The evening is over, Mr. Holloway. I suggest you leave. Now." Rafferty, recovering a fraction of his bravado, straightened his jacket. "This changes nothing. The service was still atrocious." "The service is no longer your concern," Nate said flatly. "You are no longer welcome in my establishment. Ever. As for your shirt, send me the bill. I'll take it out of the profits you're about to lose on the Aerotech deal." It was a direct challenge, a shot across the bow, in a war Rafferty hadn't even known he was fighting. The billionaire's face darkened with rage. He had been publicly defied, threatened, and dismissed. He gave Nate one last look, a promise of retribution in his stormy grey eyes, then turned on his heel without a word to Brittany and stormed out of the restaurant. His abandoned date, after a moment of panicked hesitation, gathered her purse and scurried after him. The spell was broken. A low murmur rippled through the dining room as patrons began to talk amongst themselves, dissecting the drama they had just witnessed. Mr. Henderson, looking dazed, began to discreetly manage the situation, assuring nearby tables that everything was under control. But Ophelia's world remained frozen. She was still standing by the table, the epicenter of a disaster that had somehow become a bizarre family reunion. Nate dismissed the manager with a nod. "Robert, take care of things. Give the staff the rest of the night off, fully paid. Close up early." He then turned back to Ophelia. The entire restaurant, the business, the lingering threat of Rafferty Holloway, it all faded away. There were only the two of them standing in the wreckage of her terrible evening. "Liv," he said again, his voice strained. "Let's go to the office." She followed him numbly, her legs moving on autopilot. As they walked through the now buzzing service area, She could feel the stares of her co-workers. She was no longer Ophelia, the struggling waitress. She was now a mystery, the owner's secret sister. The dynamics of her small world had been permanently altered. Nate's office was nothing like Rafferty Holloway's. It was warm and lived in, with overflowing bookshelves, a comfortable-looking leather sofa, and framed architectural sketches of the restaurant on the walls. It was the office of a creator, not a destroyer. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. For a long moment they just stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken words and 3 years of distance. "You own this place," Ophelia finally managed to ask, her voice raspy. "All this time, you owned the Gilded Spoon, and you let me work here as a waitress." The accusation was clear. Nate ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered from their youth. "It's complicated, Liv. I didn't know you were working here until about a month ago. Mr. Henderson doesn't handle the initial hiring. HR does. He only sends me the final payroll reports. When I saw your name, I was surprised. I told him to watch out for you, to make sure you were treated well." "Watch out for me?" Ophelia's voice rose, the dam of her composure finally breaking. "Watch out for me? Where have you been for the past 3 years, Nate? Where were you when Grandma's medical bills were piling up? Where were you when the bank sent the first letter I've been drowning, and you were... What building this?" She gestured around the luxurious office, her voice dripping with scorn. "You abandoned us. You abandoned me. That's not fair." Nate shot back, his own frustration boiling over. "I was dealing with things my own way, after Mum and Dad. And then Grandma. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't be in that house, surrounded by all of it. I had to get out to build something, to make sure we would never be vulnerable again." "We... There is no we," Ophelia cried, tears now streaming down her face. "There's just me, trying to hold on to the only thing we have left, and you playing Monopoly with real buildings. Did you know Grandma's house is in foreclosure? Did that show up on one of your payroll reports?" The question struck Nate like a physical blow. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a look of genuine shock and horror. "What foreclosure?" "No. Liv, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me? Call you?" She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. The successful Nathaniel Carter who couldn't even stay for the end of his own grandmother's funeral. The brother who changed his number and never once reached out to see if his little sister was still breathing. "Why would I call you for a handout? I have my pride. Nate, it's all I have left." The silence returned heavier this time, filled with the weight of their shared grief and separate pain. Nate looked utterly defeated. He sank onto the edge of his desk, his head in his hands. "I messed up, Liv," he said, his voice muffled. "I know I did. I was drowning too in my own way. I thought if I just built a big enough wall of success around myself, the pain couldn't get in. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, by not dragging you into my mess. I see now. I was just being a coward." He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I saw your name on the payroll a month ago, and I didn't know what to do. I was ashamed. I knew you wouldn't take my help if I just offered it. So I just watched from a distance, hoping for a way in. Tonight wasn't how I planned it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "Liv, the house. How much?" Ophelia recoiled as if he'd pulled a weapon. "No, I told you. I don't want your money. I don't want you to swoop in and play the hero after all this time." "This isn't about being a hero," he insisted, standing up. "This is about family. It's Grandma's house. Our house. It stopped being our house when you left it behind, she retorted. Their argument was a clash of two different kinds of grief and pride. His was born from a desperate need to escape the past, hers from an equally desperate need to preserve it. Before they could resolve anything, Nate's phone buzzed on the desk. He ignored it. It buzzed again, insistently. With a sigh of frustration, he glanced at the screen. The color drained from his face. "What is it?" Ophelia asked, her anger momentarily forgotten in the face of his sudden alarm. "It's my partner at the Aerotech Fund," Nate said grimly, looking up at her. "Holloway isn't wasting any time. He's just initiated a hostile tender offer for all outstanding Aerotech shares, effective market open tomorrow morning. And he's filed a preliminary injunction against our board, citing potential mismanagement." Ophelia didn't understand all the jargon, but she understood the tone. "What does that mean?" Nate's eyes were hard as steel. "It means the war has started. He couldn't fire you, so he's decided to try and burn my entire world down instead. And he's using all the money and power in the world to do it." He looked at Ophelia, and for the first time, she saw not just her estranged brother, but a fighter preparing for battle. "He thinks this is about business. He has no idea. This just got personal." The fight for a tech company and the fight for a family home had just become intertwined with Rafferty Holloway as their common enemy. And Ophelia was no longer just a waitress. She was standing right at the heart of the storm. The days that followed the confrontation at the Gilded Spoon were a blur of tension and surreal adjustments for Ophelia. She didn't go back to work. Nate had insisted transferring a sum of money into her account. Not a handout. He'd said, his voice strained, an advance for services rendered in exposing a world-class jerk. That was enough to halt the immediate foreclosure and give her a few weeks of breathing room. She accepted it not out of defeat, but because she recognized the bigger battle they were now facing. Her personal struggle had been absorbed into Nate's corporate war. They fell into a fragile, unspoken truce. Nate was consumed by the fight against Stratton Corp, spending his days and nights in frantic conference calls and strategy sessions with his legal team. He moved back into their grandmother's house, sleeping on the old pull-out sofa in the living room. His presence filled the creaking silence of the home, a constant, tangible reminder of their fractured past and uncertain future. The house itself became a neutral ground. In the quiet moments between Nate's calls, they would talk not about their years of estrangement, but about safer things. Memories of their grandmother's terrible cooking, the time their father tried to build a treehouse in the backyard, and ended up falling into the rose bushes. These small shared histories were like tentative bridges built across the wide canyon of their separation. Ophelia found herself looking at her brother with new eyes. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the relentless drive that had once felt like abandonment, but now looked more like a desperate form of self-preservation. She learned that after their parents' car crash, he had taken his small inheritance and poured it into a risky tech startup. When it paid off, he hadn't gone on a spending spree. He had quietly started a small venture capital fund with a partner focusing on innovative companies like Aerotech Dynamics companies that created things rather than just acquiring and dismantling them like Holloway's firm. The Gilded Spoon was a side project, a passion investment in something tangible and real, a counterpoint to the abstract world of finance he inhabited. One evening, while Nate was on another late-night call pacing the living room like a caged tiger, Ophelia retreated to the attic. It was her sanctuary, a dusty archive of their family's life. It smelled of cedarwood and aging paper. She was looking for old photo albums, seeking a reminder of a time when they were whole, but her hands found something else, a heavy leather-bound ledger tucked away in a trunk with her grandfather's belongings. Her grandfather, William Calloway, had been a builder, not a titan of industry, but a man who built homes and small commercial buildings in Queens and Brooklyn. He had died long before Ophelia was born, a figure of family legend who had reportedly lost it all in a bad business deal in the late 1970s. The family never spoke of the details. It was just a sad story, the origin point of their family's modest financial standing. Curious, she opened the ledger. The pages were filled with her grandfather's neat, angular handwriting, detailing construction costs, payrolls, and contracts. As she idly flipped through the pages, a name jumped out at her, written under a section for a large commercial development project, dated 1978. Holloway Development. A chill went down her spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. She kept reading. The ledger detailed a partnership between Calloway Construction and Holloway Development for a major project in downtown Brooklyn. Her grandfather had put up almost all of his capital and secured massive loans using his entire business as collateral. The partner was a man named Alistair Holloway, Rafferty Holloway's father. As she delved deeper, a narrative of betrayal began to emerge from the dry accounting notes. Entries showed materials being mysteriously rerouted, invoices being inflated, and payments from Holloway Development arriving late, then not at all. The final pages were a frantic scrawl of notes about legal fees, loan defaults, and foreclosure notices. Alistair Holloway had systematically bled her grandfather's company dry, then used the chaos to buy out the entire project, including all of Calloway Construction's assets for pennies on the dollar at a bankruptcy auction. It wasn't just a bad business deal. It was a deliberate predatory act of corporate sabotage. Alistair Holloway had built the foundations of his fortune on the ruins of her grandfather's life's work. The discovery of this old injustice, this original sin, resonated with the present-day conflict with a terrifying clarity. The Holloways, it seemed, had a generational talent for destruction. She heard Nate end his call downstairs and went down to find him, staring grimly at his laptop, the glow illuminating his weary face. "They're trying to paint us as incompetent," he said, without looking up. "Holloway's PR machine is working overtime. They're leaking stories to the financial press that Aerotech's leadership is in over their heads, that Stratton Corp is stepping in to save the company from itself." "Nate," Ophelia said, her voice trembling slightly as she held out the heavy ledger. "I think I found something. Something you need to see." Together they sat at the old dining room table, the same table where they'd done their homework as children, and pored over their grandfather's ledger. As Nate read, his expression shifted from curiosity to shock, and then to a slow-burning, incandescent rage. "I can't believe it," he breathed, tracing the final desperate entries with his finger. "All these years, I thought Grandpa just had bad luck. They told us he was a poor businessman, that he overextended himself." "They lied," Ophelia said softly. "The Holloway family legacy is built on a crime. They didn't just outcompete him, they destroyed him." This changed everything. The fight was no longer about a spilled glass of wine or a hostile takeover. It was about a decades-old wound. It was about historical justice. Rafferty Holloway wasn't just a corporate raider trying to take Nate's company. He was the heir to a stolen empire, continuing his father's predatory legacy. "This is the lever," Nate said, his eyes gleaming with a newfound dangerous energy. "Holloway's entire identity is tied up in his father's legacy, the myth of the self-made titan. If we can prove that the foundation of Stratton Corp, which grew out of Holloway Development, is rotten, we can turn his own narrative against him." Their strategy shifted. While Nate's lawyers continued to fight the takeover on legal and financial grounds, Ophelia began a new mission. Armed with the names, dates, and project details from the ledger, she dove into city archives, public records offices, and old newspaper microfilms at the library. She was no longer a waitress or a struggling artist. She was a forensic historian digging up the bones of a long-buried crime. She found old building permits co-signed by William Calloway and Alistair Holloway. She found property transfer deeds that showed the assets moving from Calloway to Holloway for a fraction of their value. The most damning piece of evidence came from the archives of an old Brooklyn newspaper. It was a small article about a lawsuit filed by a subcontractor against Holloway Development in 1979, alleging non-payment for materials on the very project that had bankrupted her grandfather. The case had been dismissed on a technicality, but the article quoted the subcontractor, a man named George Petrie, who claimed Alistair Holloway had boasted about bleeding his partner dry. George Petrie. Ophelia said, reading the name aloud in the quiet library. I wonder if he's still alive. A quick search online yielded an obituary for a George Petrie who had passed away in 2015. But the obituary mentioned he was survived by a son, Robert Petrie, who had taken over the family's plumbing supply business in Sunset Park. Ophelia felt a surge of adrenaline. This was a long shot, a desperate hope. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for Petrie and Son Plumbing Supply. An older man with a gruff Brooklyn accent answered. Yeah, Petrie's. Hello, Ophelia began, her heart pounding. My name is Ophelia Calloway. This is going to sound like a very strange question, but was your father named George Petrie, and did he ever do business with a man named Alistair Holloway? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Holloway, the man finally grumbled. My father had a few choice words for that son of a bitch, cursed his name till the day he died. Said Holloway cheated him, and some builder he was working with a guy named Calloway. Why are you asking? Ophelia's knuckles were white as she gripped her phone. William Calloway, she said, her voice shaking, was my grandfather. The silence on the line was even longer this time, filled with the weight of 40 years of buried history. Then Robert Petrie spoke again, his voice lower, more serious. My dad kept records of everything. He was a meticulous man. He said one day the truth would come out. I think I have a box of his old files in the back of the shop. Maybe you should come down here. As Ophelia hung up the phone, she knew she had found it. Not just a lever, as Nate had called it. She had found a weapon forged in the past, ready to be unleashed in the present. The battle against Rafferty Holloway was about to move from the boardroom to the court of public opinion, and she was holding the evidence that could bring his entire dynasty crashing down. The final showdown was not in a restaurant or a courtroom, but in the sterile, high-altitude arena, where men like Rafferty Holloway felt most at home, the emergency boardroom of Aerotech Dynamics. Holloway had forced the meeting, intending it to be the final act of his conquest. He sat at the head of the long, polished table, flanked by his lawyers, the picture of impending victory. His tender offer had secured a significant portion of the stock, and his relentless PR campaign had shaken the confidence of the remaining shareholders. Across from him sat Nate Carter, his partner, and the Aerotech board members. They looked beleaguered, but defiant. The last week had been a brutal war of attrition. Nate had spent millions fighting back, but Holloway's resources were virtually limitless. The mood in the room was grim. This felt like a surrender. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Rafferty began, his voice oozing condescending magnanimity. My offer is final. It's generous considering the mismanagement I've uncovered. You can accept it now and your board can walk away with some dignity. Or you can fight lose and be remembered as the executives who drove this promising company into the ground. Your choice. Nate leaned forward. There's a third option, Rafferty. You could withdraw your predatory offer and go back to dismantling companies that don't have the will to fight back. Rafferty chuckled. Bravado is a poor substitute for Capital Carter. You're out of moves. He gestured to one of his lawyers who slid a thick binder across the table. This is the final agreement. Just sign. At that moment, the boardroom door opened. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was Ophelia. She was not dressed in a waitress uniform or the comfortable clothes she wore around the old house. She wore a simple professional dark grey dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed, focused, and utterly unintimidated by the room full of powerful men. Beside her stood an older, stocky man in a worn work jacket, holding a dusty cardboard box. It was Robert Petrie. Rafferty stared, his eyes narrowing in disbelief and fury. What is the meaning of this? This is a closed meeting. Security. She's with me, Nate said calmly, a flicker of a smile on his face. I believe she has a presentation that the shareholders might find relevant to your character, Rafferty, and by extension, to the character of your offer. This is absurd, Rafferty snarled, his composure cracking. Get her out of here. But the other board members, desperate for any lifeline, were intrigued. Let her speak, said the chairman of Aerotech's board, an elderly man named Henderson, no relation to the restaurant manager who had built the company from his garage. Ophelia walked calmly to the front of the room, placing a simple file folder and her grandfather's ledger on the table. Robert Petrie set his box down beside it. Good morning, Ophelia began, her voice clear and steady, resonating with a strength she didn't know she possessed. My name is Ophelia Calloway. Some of you may know me as Nate Carter's sister, but today I am here as the granddaughter of William Calloway. She opened the ledger. In 1978, my grandfather, a builder, entered into a partnership with a man named Alistair Holloway, Rafferty Holloway's father, to develop a major commercial property in Brooklyn. My grandfather invested everything he had. Rafferty's face was a thundercloud. This is ancient history. It has no bearing on this transaction. On the contrary, Ophelia continued undeterred, it has every bearing on it, because this ledger details a systematic campaign of fraud and sabotage perpetrated by Alistair Holloway that drove my grandfather into bankruptcy. It shows how the Holloway family fortune, the very foundation upon which Stratton Corp was built, was launched with stolen money and a ruined life. She passed copies of the ledger's most damning pages around the table. But this is just my grandfather's word. So I did some more digging. She nodded to Robert Petrie. This is Robert Petrie. His father George was a subcontractor on that project. He sued Alistair Holloway for non-payment. Robert Petrie opened his box and began pulling out stacks of yellow documents held together by rusted paper clips. My father kept everything, he said in his gruff voice. Invoices marked, unpaid, by Holloway Development. Letters from my father to his lawyer. And this. He pulled out a small pocket-sized notebook. This is my dad's work diary. In it he wrote down conversations. On August 12, 1978, he details a conversation where Alistair Holloway bragged about how he was going to cut Calloway off at the knees and take the whole project for himself. A wave of murmurs went through the boardroom. This was no longer ancient history. It was documented first-hand evidence of predatory practices. It seems the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Nate interjected his voice, cutting through the noise. The same tactics your father used to destroy a small builder are the ones you're using today to try and destroy Aerotech. It's a family tradition. Rafferty Holloway was white as a sheet. His entire persona, his legacy, His carefully constructed mythos, it was all being dismantled in front of his peers by a woman he had tried to fire over a spilled glass of wine. "This is slander," he roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Unsubstantiated ramblings from disgruntled contractors from 40 years ago." "Then perhaps you can explain this," Ophelia said, playing her final card. She slid one last document across the table. It was a copy of the bankruptcy filing for Callaway Construction, and stapled to it was a copy of the deed transfer for the Brooklyn property. The signatory who authorized the final sale of William Callaway's assets from the bank to Holloway Development for a pittance was a junior executive at the bank overseeing the liquidation. His name was clearly legible. It was Alistair Holloway. He had acted as both predator and undertaker, orchestrating the bankruptcy, and then signing off on the transfer of assets to himself. It was a clear, stunning conflict of interest, and very likely illegal. The room fell silent. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and irrefutable. The board members looked from the documents to Rafferty Holloway, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had worshipped his father, built his life in his image. To learn that his entire inheritance was built on such a sordid crime shattered his world. The Aerotech chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway," he said, his voice cold. "In light of this information, which speaks to a generational pattern of unethical and potentially criminal business practices, this board can no longer in good faith entertain your offer. In fact, I believe we have a fiduciary duty to launch an immediate inquiry and share these findings with the SEC. Please see yourselves out." It was over. Rafferty's lawyers, mouths agape, began shuffling their papers. Rafferty himself seemed frozen, staring at Ophelia as if seeing her for the first time. She wasn't a waitress, a gnat, an inconvenience. She was his reckoning. The ghost of a past he never knew existed had risen up to claim its due. Without another word, he stood up, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the room. He didn't storm out in a rage. He exited like a defeated man, the entire edifice of his identity having been demolished in the span of 10 minutes. In the aftermath, the story exploded. The financial press, fed the story by Nate's jubilant PR team, had a field day. Holloway's hostile takeover, thwarted by sins of the father. One headline screamed. Stratton Corp's stock plummeted. Rafferty Holloway went into seclusion, his empire suddenly vulnerable, his reputation in tatters. Back in Queens, in the little house that had started it all, Nate and Ophelia stood in the backyard watching the sun set behind the silhouette of their grandmother's rose bushes. The foreclosure was permanently cancelled. Aerotech was safe. "You know," Nate said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I was wrong. I thought building things, making money was the only way to be strong, to protect the family." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new kind of respect. "But you were the one who was really protecting it, by holding on to this place, by preserving the past. You saved us live." "We saved each other," Ophelia replied, a genuine smile, finally reaching her eyes. The canyon between them was gone, replaced by a new, stronger bridge, forged in the heat of their shared battle. She had enrolled in night classes at the Art Students' League, her studio dream no longer a distant fantasy. She hadn't vanquished a billionaire to fall back into her brother's shadow. She had found her own strength. She was not just Ophelia Callaway, the waitress, or Nathaniel Carter's sister. She was Ophelia Callaway, the woman who unearthed the truth. And her future, like the canvases waiting in her small studio, was hers to paint. And that's the incredible story of how a demand to fire a waitress set off a chain reaction that exposed a 40-year-old crime and brought a ruthless billionaire to his knees. It's a powerful reminder that pride always comes before a fall, and that the past never truly stays buried. Ophelia Calloway thought she was just fighting to keep a roof over her head, but she ended up fighting for justice and reclaiming her family's honor. Nate Carter learned that true strength isn't just about building an empire, but about rebuilding the bridges you thought were burned forever. And Rafferty Holloway, he learned the hard way that everyone, no matter how insignificant they seem, has a story. If this story of unexpected twists and powerful family drama moved, you please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a good story of justice being served. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss our next video, where we dive into the chilling true story of a small town that took on a massive corporation, dumping toxic waste, and won. Thanks for listening.